morning, everyone. A return to beginnings, liberation theology at the end of the world. Theology is political language, James Cone reminds us. Katie Cannon writes, I come from a place where when people talk about field work, they literally mean field work in the fields, not ethnographic research. I come from a place where there isn't but one kind of doctor, the person who takes care of you when you are sick. The late Palestinian intellectual and activist Edward Said draws our attention to the power of thinking beginnings. His 1975 text, Beginnings, Intention and Method, comes at a time of beginnings in Said's life and intellectual development. The decade of the 1970s would begin for Said with marriage to Miriam Cortes, a librarian at American University of Beirut, and the birth of their first child, Wadi, who was named after Said's father, who would pass right after their marriage. This period marked a new beginning for Said, a new beginning of travel and engagement in the Near Eastern intellectual and political worlds. Most significantly, he would begin to engage critically and seriously Arabic philological, literary, and intellectual traditions. For Said, a beginning is not only a kind of action, it is also a frame of mind, a kind of work, an attitude, a consciousness. Beginning and beginning again are historical, whereas origins are divine. To think beginnings then is to not engage in a politics of nostalgia. It is not to recover a pristine past or to secure an uncontested future. It is to enter into a mode of critical and creative activity, to reopen what has been foreclosed, to unsettle what has been naturalized, and to imagine otherwise. Beginnings are insurgent. They interrupt. They refuse the closure that power so often demands. This 2026 Margaret Steelman lecture invites us to think beginnings, not divine origins, but the beginnings of a powerful set of ideas, insurgent practices, and critical communities that challenge the dominant ways of thinking, being, and believing. Indeed, Said extends us an invitation to fundamentally and foundationally think together how communities of faith bear witness to the infinite possibilities of human being and belonging in the world at the end of the world. In other words, at the end of a world and the emergence of new worlds. In the words of Antonio Gramsci, the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. Now is the time of monsters. We gather not only in a time of monsters, but in a time when crisis is being organized politically, economically, theologically, and culturally into new configurations of power. Authoritarianism in our moment does not merely repress, it recruits. It speaks in moral languages, inhabits religious institutions, and seeks theological legitimation. It thrives on the hollowing out of nominally democratic life, the weaponization of difference, and the disciplining of the imagination. In such a moment, the question before us is not simply what theology says, but what theology does, and to whom it serves. In a moment when theological discourse in the North Atlantic world is preoccupied with the decline of mainline Christianity, debates about post-liberalism and its US and UK varieties, and the fate of graduate theological education, A return to the beginnings invites us to open the aperture of our world. It calls us to attend to what Stuart Hall named the Great Moving Right Show, and to do so with critical precision. For Hall reminds us that we must not neglect everything particular and specific to this historical conjuncture. Those political, ideological, cultural, and economic forces that move at different tempos, whose condensation in any particular historical moment is what defines a conjuncture. Our contemporary conjuncture is one of planetary crisis. As Dipesh Chakrabarty rightly reminds us, climate change and the Anthropocene are thus problems that are profoundly political and that challenged our received institutions and imaginations at the same time. If Hall teaches us to read the conjuncture, Chakrabarty compels us to confront its planetary scale, where the crisis of democracy and the crisis of the earth are not separable. This planetary polycrisis demands not only new forms of analysis, but new forms of thinking and new forms of life. Thus, today at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, we return to the beginnings, not as an act of retrieval, but as a practice of reorientation. Not to recover the settled tradition, but to reactivate a mode of theological insurgency, one that refuses domestication and remains accountable to those on the underside of modernity. In this sense, we return to a moment in 1975 on the campus of Wake Forest University. Following the bracing visit of Martin Luther King Jr. on October 11, 1962, Wake Forest University welcomed James H. Cone as part of the student-led Biennial Challenge program. Cone arrived in the midst of a growing global conversation with African and Latin American theologians, and in the wake of a gathering at the University of Richmond on Christian faith and the Black Revolution, where he was joined with evangelical Tom Skinner, St. John's United Holy Church's Reverend James A. Forbes, and State Senator, soon to be Governor, Lawrence Douglas Wilder. On February 22nd, 1975, Cone addressed this community on Black theology, concluding with a rejection of a theology of the masters. That same year, Shirley Chisholm spoke in Waite Chapel against the cancer of racism, and Barbara Jordan became the first Black person and first woman to deliver the Wake Forest University commencement address. This was 1975. This is not merely a sequence of events. It is a convergence, a horizon of Black political and theological imagination that pressed the question of democracy, exposed the moral limits of theology, and insisted upon the inseparability of faith and freedom. What was thinkable then has, in many of our institutions, become difficult, if not impossible, to imagine now. And yet Cone's words remain. Indeed, they press us to a renewed urgency. Theology is not neutral. In a sense, all theology is committed, conditioned, and understands itself as developed within a text and context. The task then is not to deny this conditioning, but to become critically conscious of it, to refuse the seductions of neutrality that so often mask complicity. Cone's rejection of a theology of masters is not simply a critique of the past. It is an indictment of any theological discourse that seeks relevance without risk, reflection without solidarity, and that seeks to move to levels of abstraction without accountability. In such a moment, theology is not to be merely interpretive, it must be insurgent. It must not only describe the world, but participate in its reconfiguration. It must align itself, as Howard Thurman so powerfully reminds us, with those who have their backs up against the wall, the poor, the disinherited, the dispossessed. For it is there and only there that theology retains its integrity and its possibility. So let us begin with what Toni Morrison names the dancing mind. Not a passive peace, not absence of conflict, but a disciplined openness that resists domination, including the domination of institutionalized discourses of theology itself. It is a cultivated practice of engaging another mind without coercion, without closure, and without fear. It is this sense, an epistemology, an ethic, and a politics that we seek to enact today. Morrison reminds us that such a piece of the dancing mind requires vigilance, that the threats that come to it not only come from visible forces of repression, but from the quieter encroachments of wealth, government control, and cultural expediency that seek to narrow the space of thought and foreclose the possibilities of imagination. To secure the peace of the dancing mind, then, is to engage in struggle. A struggle over what can be thought, what can be said, and what can be made possible. This is the theological task for us today. This is our work. Let us get to work with a dancing mind, not in the comfort of inherited certainties, but in the risk of new beginnings, not in the safety of abstraction, but in the demands of solidarity, not apart from the struggles of those who have their backs up against the wall, but alongside them. For this is where the futures of liberation theology are. And indeed, we stand along with the beautiful ones who remain yet to be born. This is our task and this is our work today. Let us get to work. I'm going to invite two of our dear colleagues to begin our first conversation. The Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas is currently visiting professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School. She is an internationally acclaimed leader in the field of womanist theology, racial reconciliation, social justice, and sexuality in the Black church. Born in Washington, D.C. and raised in Dayton, Ohio, Dr. Douglas was one of the first 10 Black women to be ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church. She was also associate priest at Holy Comforter Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. for more than 20 years. From 2017 to 2023, she was dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and professor of theology. She was named the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union in November of 2019, where she is now Dean Emeritus. She served as interim president of Episcopal Divinity School from 2023 to 2024, and during the 2023 fall term, she served as honorary professor of global theology at Emmanuel Theological College in Liverpool, England. Douglas currently serves as the canon theologian at Washington National Cathedral and Anglican Communion canon at Newcastle Cathedral in Newcastle, England. Prior to Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary, she served as professor of religion at Goucher College, where she held the Susan D. Morgan Professorship of Religion and is now Professor Emeritus. Before Goucher, she was associate professor of theology at Howard University School of Divinity and associate professor of religion at Edward Waters College. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Denison University, where she earned a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology, Douglas went on to earn a Master of Divinity and PhD in Systematic Theology from Union Theological Seminary with James H. Cone. Douglas is the author of many articles and 6 books, including The Black Christ, Sexuality in the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective, Black Bodies and the Black Church, A Blue Slant, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, and the 2023 Guallermeyer Award-winning book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. Her current research interests include expanding the moral imaginary and fostering a more just future. Douglas proudly serves on the New York City Homeless Coalition Board and the Public Religion and Research Institute Board of Directors. She's also a member of the American Academy of Religion, the Society for the Study of Black Religion, and the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians. Joining Dr. Douglas in our first conversation is Edgardo Colón-Emeric, who is Dean of Duke University's Divinity School and the Ruth and A. Morris Williams Jr. Professor of Theology and Christian Ministry. Edgardo's research explores the intersection of Methodist and Catholic theologies and Wesleyan and Latin American experiences. His teaching covers a broad range of theological areas: systematic Wesleyan theology, ecumenism, and Latin American theology. His research brings theologians like Thomas Aquinas and Hans Ernst von Balthasar into conversation with voices from the theological periphery like Bartolomé de las Casas and St. Oscar Romero, guided by the conviction that Christian theology sounds best when it is symphonic. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, Edgardo was the first Latino to be ordained an elder in the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and was founding pastor of Cristo Vive United Methodist Church in Durham, North Carolina. He became founding director of the Hispanic House of Studies at Duke Divinity School in 2007 and joined the Duke Divinity School faculty in 2008. Since 2010, he has served as director of the Central American Methodist Course of Study, which trains Methodist pastors who have not earned a formal Master of Divinity degree in such places as El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. He is also director of the Duke Peru Theological Initiative, a partnership between the Methodist Church of Peru and Duke Divinity School. He became director of the Center for Reconciliation in 2018, and under his leadership, the Center for Reconciliation expanded its capacities and programs, including the launch of the Americas Initiative that brings together scholars and ministry partners from across the Americas to support reconciliation work. In 2020, he was appointed Associate Dean of Academic Formation, and Edgardo currently serves on the United Methodist Committee on Faith and Order and on both national and international Methodist Catholic dialogues. Edgardo is the author of Wesley Aquinas and Christian Perfection, an Ecumenical Dialogue, which received the 2008 Aquinas Dissertation Prize from the Aquinas Center for Theological Renewal, and Oscar Romero's Theological Vision, Liberation and the Transfiguration of the Poor, which received first place in the 2019 Catholic Press Association Award for books about newly canonized saints. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Brown Douglas and Edgardo Colón-Emeric.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction, and thank you more for inviting me to be a participant of this very important conference on liberation theology. As both you and Dr. Gandalf said, there's no time more important than today to begin to reflect again and to bring back into public discourse and onto the public square liberation theology and its claims, and to rethink its relevance. It is a privilege to be here in conversation with Edgardo and with many of my colleagues and friends who are here. So thank you so much. I will be brief in my remarks as they hopefully serve for, as we theologians like to say, prolegomena, the word before the word, for a more robust conversation with all of you regarding liberation theology. Let me begin with this observation by W.E.B. Du Bois in his work on the Reconstruction. He said this: "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery." Why do I begin here? Du Bois describes a pattern in history that defines Black people's movement toward freedom. Every time that there is progress in this regard, there is a profound backlash. Today, in this current presidential regime, we find ourselves in the midst of a period of backlash. Backlash to the progress that was presumably signaled by a Black president, as well as by the Black Lives Matter movement's responses instigated by the spectacle murder of George Floyd. And so it is in the context, this context, of moving back toward slavery, this context that is fascist, white supremacist, anti-freedom, anti-just, amoral, moral, narcissistic, non-liberatory movement. It is in this context that we reflect upon the past, the present, and future significance of liberation theology. Now, my first introduction to liberation theology, to theology period, was through the work of James Cone. As I have stated on many occasions, I was introduced to his book, A Black Theology of Liberation, my junior year in college by my college chaplain at Denison University, David Woodyard, when he noticed my crisis of faith as I wrestled with the dilemma of being at once Black, which I was not willing to give up, and Christian, which I was willing to give up, if Christianity had nothing to do with my Blackness. Reading Cone's book resolved my dilemma. For what I discovered after reading it twice in one weekend was the fundamental claim of liberation theology, that God was a liberator, acting on the side of the oppressed. This claim was more than theological, ideological, wishful thinking. Rather, as Cone's work made clear, it reflected the central theme of the Bible. It reflected the meaning of God's revelation in the Exodus story, as well as in Jesus' ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection. Moreover, it was the theological core and testimony of the Black faith tradition, a tradition that was born in the hush harbors and formed by an African religious heritage, to which I will return. It was through Cone's work that I would then go on again in my junior year in college to encounter the work of Gustavo Gutierrez, his work, A Theology of Liberation. Now, inasmuch as liberation theology holds personal significance for me, not the least of which it saved me from abandoning Christianity and set me on this theological journey, its true significance lies in the meaning it has for the doing and the history of theology. For liberation theology reflected a theological shift, not unlike those shifts from orthodoxy to liberalism to neo-orthodoxy. For what liberation theology proclaimed was not only that God was a liberator, but also that there was a divine preferential option for the poor, the oppressed. Put simply, it proclaimed that if we are to understand the meaning of God's movement in human history, if we are to understand the meaning of God's justice, the meaning of God's freedom, it must be done from the vantage point of the poor and the oppressed, from those whom I identify as the crucified classes of people that experience only the underside of justice. To recognize this preferential option of the poor, of the oppressed, is reflected indeed in the origins of liberation theology itself. For a while, Colón and Gutierrez and other theologians of liberation articulated this as members, if you will, of the Theological Guild. They were not the first to make this claim or to know it. There were those unlearned theologians before them who understood this profoundly. The poor, the oppressed, in this instance, the black folks who birthed the black faith tradition, the ones who provided us with they're the ones who provided us with some of the earliest liberation theological testimonies, as found in the spirituals. The God of the spirituals is a liberator. The spirituals from which Colón drew his work represent the first texts of liberation theology, as do the embodied experiences of the people who worked the fields. Liberation theology was born, as borrowing as well from Katie Cannon, born of the field work of those enslaved, oppressed peoples, especially from the work, if we are to give a preferential option for the poor and oppressed, those women, not to speak of those black queer field workers whose stories are still not fully disclosed. These are the people who witnessed to a God of justice. These are the people who were first to recognize the God who comes to set the captives free. And this brings us back to this current moment in which we find ourselves, moving right back toward the realities of white supremacist capitalistic slavery. And so, what is it then that we can say about God as liberator today, given the persistence of the inertia that is non-liberatory, unjust, unfreedom, if you will? How do we dare call God a liberator when liberation is still not a reality, as we still live in the afterlife of slavery, as Black studies scholar Saidiya Hartman rightly points us to? Indeed, drawing from Hartman and other Black studies scholars, this is where the concept of fugitivity becomes helpful in understanding what it means for God to be a liberator today, and thus the implications of liberation theology for now and for in the future. Fugitivity. To speak of fugitivity is to understand what it means to, in fact, live in the afterlife of slavery. For it is to recognize that though emancipated, Black people are not free. In this regard, to live Black life in America is to know that freedom is always incomplete, always revocable, always vulnerable to being pulled back toward slavery through new enactments of the slavocracy. Yet within this fugitive space, there are enactments, if you will, of freedom, of justice, for fugitivity is always the refusal to accept the precarity of Black life. Fugitivity refuses the narratives of inferiority, of control, and expendability that white supremacist anti-Blackness requires. Fugitivity rejects the demands to accept unfreedom as normal. Fugitive acts are often quotidian, that is, ordinary everyday gestures, practices, and ways of living that refuse to be defined or confined by racialized injustice or injustice of any kind, that is, the afterlife of a slavocracy. What makes these acts fugitive? is precisely because they emerge within conditions where agency appears foreclosed and otherwise possibilities seem unimaginable. They emerge in fugitive existence. In theological terms, then, fugitivity represents the already but not yet reality of God's justice, the already but not yet reality of God's freedom, of God's just future. And so it is to talk about God as liberator, is to understand the fugitivity of God's liberating revelation. That is to say, divine revelation is not about, divine liberation is not about a singular act, nor about a culminating miraculous act of perfect freedom or justice. It is not something that we should be waiting for. Rather, it is about the way in which God is present. It is about the way in which God is moving in the historical present. It is about a divine movement of justice, of freedom, of liberation on the earth, within our world, within our society, within always an historical present that is defined by injustice and unfreedom. That God is liberator, as liberation theologians proclaimed, is to recognize God's divine refusal for those realities of injustice and unfreedom to have the last word, the divine refusal to give in to these realities. And thus it is to recognize God's quotidian, if you will, acts of justice and freedom that are always pointing us toward otherwise possibilities, not of waiting, but of living and being present in this world, in this historical reality, for and with each other. Put another way, to recognize the God who is liberator is to recognize, even in our everydayness, the ways in which God is acting and calling us to free ourselves from anything, be it the systemic or structural realities or that little piece of the oppressor which reigns within us, as Audre Lorde would say, to free ourselves from those things that stand in the way of us experiencing the justice of God, which means experiencing that which respects and affirms the sacred dignity and humanity of each and every human being. For each and every person that has breath or has ever had breath is a sacred creature and child of God's. And freedom means treating them as such. It is in this way, then, that we can think of Black faith as a fugitive faith. For it is faith in a liberating God in a world hostile to such faith. It is in this way that liberation theology has enduring significance. For it is not about a God who comes to us in perfect times, or a God who promises to rescue us and bring us at once to a utopian future of freedom. Rather, it points to a God who comes to us in the fugitivity of our existence, calling us to a fugitive, liberatory way of living otherwise in the present, while gesturing toward Black futurity or divine futurity, where God's freedom is made known. Liberation theology, then, is the art of theological refusal within social political context, which indeed continues to act against the very freedom and justice that God promises us all. So fugitivity and a theology of liberation in a fugitive space is not escape. It is a rebellious presence. It means creating life, meaning, and possibility within a world structured against one's very flourishing. This is the meaning of faith in a God that is liberator. For it is about nothing less than partnering with this God in the liminal space of emancipation and yet not free. It is a call for us to reimagine rather, our participation in the work of justice, and to recognize ourselves as partners in the unfolding of God's liberating purposes. It is about refusing to be compliant with, silent in the face of, or to despair or be afraid to act in resistance to the present white supremacist anti-God regime. We who claim to carry forth a liberation theological legacy are constrained to partner with a God who offers us otherwise possibilities of acting and enacting justice and freedom in this world. And so it is that liberation theology that continues to be significant is one that will direct our attention always toward the margins, among the displaced, the silenced, the harmed, and the forgotten, whose faith in a liberating God moves them, with or without us, to keep resisting, to keep refusing, and to keep believing that even now, even here, in this fugitive space, another world is possible. To be a liberation theologian is to make that proclamation not plain, but real. Thank you.
Paz y bien, peace and goodness be with you. I first of all want to say thank you for Dean Walker and Dr. Gandolfo's invitation to be present with you, and also to Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas for opening the way for us and our imaginations and our conversation in such a powerful way. I have to begin for myself with an admission, a confession, if you will. When I was asked to come here and given the question to reflect on the future of liberation theology, it led me to reflect on my own story and feel very inadequate to the task. I have pastored Hispanic and multicultural congregations with significant presence of undocumented people in them. I have launched, as you heard, theological education programs in Central America and South America. I've taught and written on Hispanic and Latin American liberation theologians. I had the opportunity, incredible opportunity once, of presiding at Eucharist when Gustavo Gutierrez was preaching at the Divinity School. In other words, I've been deeply, powerfully formed by liberation theology and by those longing for liberation. Even so, I have never called myself a liberation theologian. And as I pondered why, came up perhaps with two reasons why. First, the refusal to be so easily pigeonholed and, in that sense, dismissed. But more profoundly, because I do not see myself worthy of that title. When I was doing research on my book on Oscar Romero, I was given a little office space at the University of Central America. This is the university where in 1989, the Jesuit priests who lived there, housekeeper and housekeeper's daughter, were assassinated by a death squad. And the little office I had contained some remains of the papers from the theologians, and also grass clippings with blood from them. And I was working there on my book that I was hoping would be my tenure case book. And I was thinking, what am I worried about? A bad review? A failed tenure case? Those were liberation theologians. We're doing theology with and for the poor, meant running the risk and dangers of the poor in that setting and time. I was not in that same place. And so I refer to myself and then as a Methodist theologian, or Metodista, perhaps more accurately. From Justo Gonzalez, I've learned how to read the Bible, read Wesley in Spanish. I could explain what that means. It's not just reading him in Spanish. It means more to it than that. And I also do theology in a Catholic spirit from the Methodist Church for the whole church and vice versa. I engage in ressourcement from the margins and engage in, look for ways to concretar, to make concrete Christian conversations to serve the present age. And at the same, and all this with a sense of from the margins and for the margins, but not as one who is myself in the margins, because I have to acknowledge my own location. My own location as someone who is a theologian, an academically trained theologian at Duke University, and a dean of a divinity school. And I come with all those reflections then to reflect on our contemporary moment and the futures of liberation theology. The density of the moment has already been described and will be continued to something that will reflect on throughout the day, the signs of our times, the chaos of our times, which is also a kairos for us, and a kairos, I believe, for liberation theology. We are in an age of ecological degradation, and with that, a kairos for a theology that answers the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, and hears in them the cry of Christ. An age of mass migration, where we see the hardening of borders, the closing of hearts, dehumanizing rhetoric, brutal enforcement, and with these, a kairos for a theology that presents and offers humanizing ways of affirming pluralism and promoting belonging, particularly of and for the marginalized. An age of AI and a digital revolution, where mental health and income and power inequalities and polarization, etc., find themselves increasing. And with that, a kairos for a theology that promotes the value of human life and the dignity of human work in a call against visions that are transhumanist and post-humanist when they look at the future. And so when I think of the futures of liberation theology from my ecclesial, disciplinary, and social location, I do so with both fear and trembling, and also with a profound sense of pressing need. I do so with a sense of mutual accountability for questions that I ask myself regarding in my theological work, is it true? Is it more than my own personal opinions or wishful thinking? Am I avoiding, and how am I protected from falling into the twin tyrannies of triumphalism or relativism? Is it faithful to the future that God has promised? Is it good? Does my theological reflections offer a vision of abundant life for all, particularly the poor and vulnerable? No theology is tamper-proof, but does my theological reflections resist evil in its many guises, particularly those fashionable today? Is it beautiful? Does it make the heart sing? Is it, in the words of the theologian Cecilia González Andreu, a bridge to wonder? Does it empower the young to see visions and the old to dream dreams? These are questions that I reflect on for myself as I seek to engage our contemporary moment, and I do so also with discerning application of Martin Luther's criterion crux probat omnia. The cross is a test of everything. Martin Luther, in his Heidelberg Disputation of 1518, contrasts the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. That contrast is one that in Europe begat a reformed idea of the church and its relation to the world, and in Central America begat a new idea of the university and of theology for the sake of the world. I had the opportunity last fall of revisiting a place that has been deeply formative for me, the Chapel of Jesus Christ the Liberator at the University of Central America. For those of you who have not been to this place, it is a chapel that captures the spirit of Oscar Romero's theology and the intellectual projects of the faculty at the University of Central America in San Salvador. The chapel, when you face the altar area, you see these beautiful colored panels, wood panels, depicting the struggles of the Civil War era in El Salvador, but in colors that are very vibrant, suggesting that even in the midst of death, there's life, that there's resurrection all around. And that's the view that the congregation has as they are facing the pulpit and the preacher and the altar and the presider. The view the presider has is a very different one. On the back of the church, on the wall, is a set of pencil drawings, so on white paper, white cloth, depicting not the stations of the cross, but the stations of the crucified people. They are drawings of tortured bodies, mutilated, and it's a permanent exhibit. It's not something temporary. And so there's this view, this diptych, if you will, of death and resurrection, of lament and hope, of Good Friday, Easter Sunday. And this captured Romero's imagination. It captured the vision of the University of Central America, which Yacuria, who was the one who designed that chapel and was himself martyred on that campus, spoke as a university that would need to be present intellectually where it was needed to provide science for those without science, skills for those without skills, a voice for those without voices, to give intellectual support for those who do not possess the academic qualifications to make their rights legitimate. That the crucified people and the university shared a common mission. And that was a Samaritan mission. And it's one that embodies the vision of Romero, and I believe speaks to me for how I should engage in theology and liberation, and how I think of the future of liberation theology today. And I'll draw just 2 points from this, the theological diptych for a integral liberation theology, as Romero would speak of it. And the first is that it is a Lenten vision. It's a Lenten vision because in the phrase from Elsa Tames's book on scripture meditations, we are living under a sky without stars. A sky without stars because some of the lights that have traditionally guided our journey have failed. Bright stars have at times become, if you will, collapsed into black holes. I can think only of some of the tremendous moral failures of some whom we were looked to as luminaries and whose fall has now given rise to so many questions and so much pain. Other stars still shine, but they are hard to see from where we stand because there are clouds, atmospheric disturbances that block our view, that diffuse their light, or perhaps light pollution that help guiding lights that supposedly point the way, but they point the wrong way, and they spoil our night vision. And in this time, in this Lenten vision, without stars, I find the counsel of John of the Cross and the mystics to be helpful. To find the fountain, para encontrar la fuente, solo la sed nos alumbra. To find the fountain, only thirst guides the way. Only thirst thirst lights the way. That in a time when we are working in a sky without stars, then our very thirst for justice, for truth, that thirst, that burning thirst for a world different than the world we know is what actually lights our path. And this is, if you will, Lenten wisdom, and another word for this thirst is hope, because Lent ends in Easter. And the liberation theology in the spirit of Romero and this theological diptych that I mentioned is a Paschal liberation theology. The Mysterium Liberationis, the mystery of liberation, is a Paschal mystery. And in this Paschal mystery, for myself, I find that I look for transit lines in turbulent times, looking for those guideposts that help me align my theological reflection and, in my case, my responsibility and care for an institution, to align it in ways that lead to liberation. So that, for example, in a time when we're facing ecological devastation, I look to this year, which is the 800th anniversary of the death of St. Francis of Assisi, and look to the creation of a new feast, the Feast of Creation, on September 1st, the first new liturgical feast in many, many years in the Church's liturgical calendar. And I hear again the call that Francis heard, repair my house, for as you can see, it is falling into ruin. And I say, okay, there is a line through which to chart the path through the turbulence of this time. Or I think of this year also, a year of the commemoration, not celebration, of the 250th of the United States, which follows on the heels of the 1700 of Nicaea. And I think of we the people, and we believe, and the significance and the call, Kairos call for liberation theology to critique both we's, to untangle them, and to reconfigure their connections in ways that are liberative and life-giving. I look ahead to the year 2030, Nazareth 2000. The 2000th anniversary since when Jesus got up to that synagogue in the little town of Nazareth and said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." The 50th year of Romero's martyrdom that year as well. There is a transit line through which to chart and find a way in reflecting through what does it mean to be human in an age of AI, how to do theology in a new revolutionary situation, the digital revolution, how to do theology in the context of that revolution, where workers and humanity itself is being sidelined and marginalized for the sake of efficiency and economic profit. And further ahead, 2033, Pentecost 2000, and dreams of a Pentecost liberation theology, where the Spirit of the Lord is given and empowers a theology that helps the young see visions again, and even old people like myself dream dreams again. And so I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, both Kelly and Edgardo provided us with some deep and powerful reflections that in many ways you can begin to think through them together. And I want to pick up one theme that you both open up with. Kelly, you went back to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and utilized Black Reconstruction as a moment to think about the backlash. And Edgardo, you talked about how you had this challenge of identifying as a liberation theologian because you did not want to be pigeonholed and dismissed. you're both talking about those epistemic structures that seek to limit fugitivity or even a feast of fugitivity. How do we begin to think through those deep limitations of backlash? I'm reminded that King said backlash doesn't mean that we've agreed on something and then we're going against it. Backlash means that we never fundamentally thought we had this agreement in the first place. So it's not going back, right? And then how do we understand these powerful forces that then move us to identify in ways that would then challenge us or pigeonhole us? I mean, even this conversation, to have this conversation on liberation theology in this space with, I'm reminded the ACC has the largest number of ATS theological schools of any Power Four conference in the nation. We have 2 deans of ACC schools here, 2 major universities with schools in this space on liberation theology. How do we wrestle with those tremendous powers that at moments can force us into, force these backlash, and then at moments create these artificial barriers to recognizing the possibilities of new feast days or new futures?
Let's start with you.
No, thank you. First of all, again, for me, the recognition of, or concern, if you will, around what's called stolen valor. And that I simply, in my location, will not face the risks and pay the costs for what I think, write, or say that some other people have. Because I'm very protected in many ways. And so that's also why I want to be careful about how I claim names and so forth. But then the recognition that I am in space of, occupy a position of tremendous privilege and at Duke University, and that has a powerful force also on my imagination, I have to acknowledge, and also on how I live. And so for me, the importance of remaining connected with community is how I also seek to not let the structures trap my own imagination, my own intellectual work, my own heart. At the same, how successful I am at that would be for others to say, or for God to say. But there's also, of course, with occupying this place, the responsibility and possibilities that are present, and with that, I believe that conferences like this and the work that we're trying to do within our own, each of us within our own spheres, seeks to the best of our ability, say we have received I've received these privileges and these opportunities. How do I use them well, and how do I serve well? And as I say, it's an ongoing struggle. I'll stop there. I'm sure there'll be better wisdom coming from my right here.
Oh, I don't know if it's better wisdom at all, because we're all in this effort of trying to be better and to do better as we learn. I think, for me, in response to that question, almost sort of building upon what you've just said in terms of responsibility, that it is for us a matter of accountability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To whom do we hold ourselves accountable?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in this regard, I think of what Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins described as the outsider within location. And so that I see myself, if see ourselves, as outsiders within these structures of domination, these structures of these normative structures, if you will. Now, so the question is, are we accountable to these systems and structures? And so that the work that we do and the way in which we move is so that we gain credibility within those structures, gain a secure place at the table within those structures and systems, whatever they may be? Or do we hold ourselves accountable to those not only on the outside, but on the underside of the outside, right? And if we do that, and we don't, and it's always, I'm not saying that I do that and I do it perfectly, but that's the call of accountability, that we have to struggle to live into that, because if we do that, then we find ourselves really acting against what appears to be our self-interest to have a stable seat at the table, right? And so that but as we act against that, we're actually acting in accord with our own real self-interest, which is the self-interest that all of us, as Fannie Lou Hamer would say, can find a place to be free, right? And so I think that this is a question of accountability, Dr. Walker, Dean Walker, when you talk about backlash, because we don't worry about the backlash, right? The reality of being a part of a faith tradition with a daggone crucifixion at the center is to know that the backlash will always be there. That's right? And so that it then becomes, we don't worry about that. What we worry about is holding ourselves accountable, right? And when we do that, if we hold ourselves accountable to those on the underside of the outside, then we actually find ourselves more aligned with the movement of God that gets us to the crucifixion in the first place. And so that's work, that's struggle, that is constant calling oneself to account. That's constantly recognizing the ways in which, sort of like when Jesus recognized when he talked to the Syrophoenician woman that he had gotten himself hung up on the structures that, on the inside, right? And she called him back to an accountability to the people on the underside of the outside. Jesus said, oops, made a mistake. So, if Jesus can make a mistake, sometimes we do too, but it's about being called back, and those people on the outside will call us back, right? And so that's how I see it, as a question of accountability and a call for us to always hold ourselves accountable, and that when we fail in doing so, fail forward and keep going.
Thank you so much. Both of you provided us with a unique story of your formation and of how liberation theology formed and shaped your theological imagination. Whether it was at Denison College, first getting Cone's text and then Gustavo Gutierrez's text, or recognizing at UNCA what's going on. Let me see, here it's the grass with the blood of the 6 Jesuit martyrs. Recognizing that this is something more than just the book. What's the worst that can happen? I'm reminded when I first started teaching at UVA, my first graduate class was on Black theology. And I had 2 students. 1, 2. That was it. I was third, so I was Trinity. We had Trinity. We had 3 students in the seminar. I mean, this was a long time ago. This was like 2 decades ago, 2003. Both students went on and got PhDs, one, Sarah. But I'm concerned that these rich stories of this formation what happens to that formation in our moment where we see that sort of formation eroding in these places that can form that next generation? How do we wrestle with that? How do we think about the future of forming the next generation of these theologians in these spaces when those resources, those experiences, those stories are not passed on?
Yeah, let me say a couple, yes, and we're in this moment, and so I want to say something about the importance of what happens in these sort of classroom spaces and in other spaces, because I think that the moment we're in, there have to be other spaces to pass down these stories. Yeah. But I also think that formation, in many respects, or maybe it's the question that doesn't begin there, because what I think for me, and I've again written about this and spoken about this in many different places because it was formative and continues to be for me, that the introduction to theology actually helped me make sense of contradictions in a reality that I had already experienced and was trying to figure out. And that began, and I won't go into the length of the story, written it before, but that began for me long ago when I was a child of about 7 or 8 years old, no more than 8, growing up in Dayton, Ohio. When I recognized first my own relative privilege as a member of the sort of black middle class or working class, that, you know, maybe we weren't one paycheck away from poverty, we were 2, but or 1.5, because we truly were 1.5. And the reality of others that really were facing desperate situations of living. And when I was a child of 7 or 8, I was driving downtown with my parents, and I looked out a window. It was a cold, dreary, rainy day, and I saw 2 children that in my childhood mind were about my age. I imagined them as brother or sister, not dressed for the weather. It made me cry. And I took a vow to myself that day in the back seat of my parents' car with tears coming down my 7 or 8-year-old face, that I would one day come back and get those children. I thought then that I'd grow up, they'd stay young, I could come back and get them. As that, of course, changed, what didn't change was the sense of accountability to those children. They're still at the center. At the same time, even though as an Episcopalian, we did talk about Jesus in church, and I went to a black Episcopal church, and I loved hearing stories about Jesus, and especially the story of Jesus being born in a manger. I didn't know what theology was, I'd never heard of the word, but I guess I was sort of doing some little theological thinking then, and I equated those children with Jesus being born in the manger, right? So that stayed with me, and so that was sort of a part of my wrestlings, and so the introduction to black theology made it make sense and helped me to understand, well, whoa, you know, nothing's wrong with this connection. Something's wrong with the church that doesn't make those connections. So that kept me along this journey. Now, that was an important moment, and that I was able then to be introduced to not simply the theological stories, but the stories and in Black history, through Black literature, Black whatever, the various ways of people that had not only this faith, that people that continued to struggle for freedom, that people that struggled for freedom even when they knew they weren't going to experience that freedom, and the tools that they had to navigate, the tools that they used to maintain the faith in these sort of, as we might say, fugitive circumstances, unfree circumstances. When we deprive, and so you're right, this generation beneath us, the generation that's in college now, the generation that's in high school, et cetera, this generation that is beneath us, while it has taken less than a year, maybe in fact less than 6 months or 2 months to destroy us, to obliterate even being on the ark that aspires toward freedom and justice, toward a democracy. It's going to take a generation's worth of work to get us even back toward the aspiration. And therefore, our task is to not only protest, but I say it's a task of promise, to plant the seeds so that this next generation has some understanding of justice that is beyond these realities that they see, and so that we expand the moral imaginary toward justice. That's why it is important. The question you ask is an important question of what is our responsibility for making sure that this next generation has the stories, the narratives that will help them navigate, not only navigate the realities to build it for their present, but to build a more just future, which means the tools, the narratives, the stories to help them form, or if you will, to expand their moral imaginary of what justice can look like. So we must keep, even against the tide of the places we may be in, find ways to continue to teach that material. We know people. Who was it that was telling me a story, or I was reading of people who would, Sterling Brown, right? And she's up at Harvard. I don't know why I can't call her name. Prolific, wonderful MacArthur scholar, Black woman. I just can't call her name. Not Tracy. She's in the sort of Black Women in Gender Studies program. And she's working on, she's at Radcliffe Institute. I'll look it up. Look, if you have your thing, she's at Radcliffe Institute.
You want to call her name?
And she's working on her research for, right now, on Sterling Brown. You will know their name, but I just can't call it because I'm 69 years old. And so, you let go of these things. Say it. Amani Perry. There is a God in the back of the room. She told a story of Sterling Brown when he taught at Howard. Mm-hmm. And and Howard wasn't always, Howard. He would teach these students mm-hmm. in his basement, right? In his home.
Sterling, home, basement. There are a couple of joints around the corner.
Yeah.
SNCC. Yeah. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee folks, Charlie Cobb, Michael Thelwell.
There you go.
They
were you
on
there? No, you could. I thought I was old.
I think I was there. People be like, no, but Sterling,
they found a way to do it.
Yep.
That's what you call living in these fugitive spaces. They refused the refusal, mm-hmm. right? They refused to be refused because these stories are too important. Because they kept teaching, they kept telling the stories. You and I are sitting here. Mm-hmm. And trying to tell the story, they found a way to do it. So you are right that we have to find a way to do it, even when our universities tell us we can't put them in the curriculum. Then you know what? Then change the daggone name and teach it anyway. Right?
Yep.
Or, we have other spaces which we move. We invite our students there. We teach it anyway. And I tell you, churches and other religious institutions have to be the sanctuary for these banned stories, because these banned stories are the guide to our future, the promise of our future. So we just got to find what you were so right that formation is important. Students are coming forward, and if we got to form it in a different way, even when this regime won't let us. So it is our responsibility. That's how liberation theology is going to live, is to find ways to teach it and to do it anyway. So I'll just stop there.
One thing I'll thank you, and made so many directions to go here. One thing I'm thinking about too is how is it that we who are in institutions like ours support places that don't have access to institutions, so that liberation theology can grow in those places. As I look, for example, the Latin American scene is one where the institutions that gave rise to the people whose names we've already mentioned here have largely eroded, and the networks that supported liberation theologians in the 80s and 90s are simply not what they were, for many reasons. But one of my senses of responsibility is also, what is a responsibility to those places as well? So beyond the United States location, how do we partner and work and walk with locations in the majority world, Global South? Use your terminology. For myself, I've been most closely connected with Latin America, in seeing that that the voices there are heard, and also have the instruments to develop and so they can also engage us in conversation, and challenge our own blind spots as well. I mean, an exchange of gifts in that regard too. And so, because I see that there's a way in which the U.S. questions are our questions, but they're not the only set of questions, and they're all very much interconnected, particularly in our time. And so, for me, this is also another way in which I find also that I do formation is also the movement and pilgrimage and journey, sacred journey, and way of going to those places where formation happened, or where significant historical events happened, or places where the arts open imagination for liberation and for new ways of viewing the world. But then also for me, this question of what is our responsibility to supporting institutions and networks in other places as well. We have so much here, even as we feel that we don't. And I know you had a development person come up here. We do. I have that team too, and so I'm with you. At the same time, how are we? I do believe the futures of liberation theology, if they're going to be truly liberative, have to be global, and have to be ecumenical, and so how is it that those connections also help open up our parochialism that we all carry as well?
Can I say one quick thing? I so absolutely agree with that in global connection. Something else you said also reminded me is that liberation theology, whether they recognize it as theology or call it that, it's sort of like what we both said. Really, we articulate it as having the luxury of being able to be scholars and all that. And our task is to even sort of that praxis movement, feed it back. But it still lives. I mean, I think of, and we need to lift up the places where it has always lived, right? Even if it's articulated. I think of something like, and we lift it up and we learn from it. I think of Bad Bunny's halftime performance. Really, I mean, that not only was a cultural tour de force, but it told a story, right? And it told a story of a people's struggle for freedom. It told a story of a people affirming their humanity, their right to be free, and finding a way to always make a way and to struggle toward justice in a world and a society that denied their presence. Go back and watch Bad. You don't have to understand the words if you don't know Spanish, but the story is there. And there's so much to learn from that story. It took us all from the sugar canes all the way up to this current reality of mass immigration and dehumanization of a Latinx people. And so it lives in our music. It lives in the juke joints, right? It lives, I mean, if you ain't seen Sinners, I've seen it now 3 times, go see it, because it's telling a story. And so we have to find, and even if we talk about formation, there are other ways other than something happening in the classroom and reading text that people are formed and can be shaped. And so it is through the arts, it's through the music, it's through the everyday juke joints, if you will, and our artists. Look at Misty Copeland and her dance, right? You know, forget Timothy Chalamet, but listen to, right? But really, you know, Misty Copeland. There was.
She will be our commencement speaker this year at Wake Forest. Yeah.
So why didn't you invite me down then? But that's whom we need to be accountable. Those become our resources, and that's where the story continues to be told, because we've always found underground ways to tell the story, and that's where it's continuing to be told.
I want to pick up on that theme of the underground, that theme of fugitivity, and the global nature, the planetary nature of what's needed now. And going back to think about how we narrate these beginnings of liberation theology, we do narrate them within geopolitical containers. When we narrate them, we'd say Latin America, and we narrate it within a container. Say Black, we're looking at the U.S. and we're saying it within a geopolitical container, but these movements are always already global. They're always already connected. And they're moving in these protein ways. So you can think of the meetings of Black and African theologians in 71. You can think of Dar es Salaam and Six Pack in 74. You can think of these global spaces. You can think of Geneva in 73 when Latin American and Black theologians, Detroit, these all in the 70s. They're always moving. Dias Nascimento and the Black movement in Brazil, these are movements that are moving together, but yet the ways in which we think of sovereignty reassert themselves. So we begin to move back into these geopolitical containers. How do we push through to really think to foment a fugitivity that is planetary? That we recognize, if I'm thinking what's going on in Latin and South America, I'm inevitably also thinking about U.S. government. I'm thinking about the reactions against Vietnam. I'm also thinking of Reagan's disastrous foreign policy in the 1980s that facilitated so many dictatorships. I'm also thinking of those Pan-African ways of connecting that were challenging. I'm also thinking of the ways in which theologians are coming together, both across spaces internationally and also challenges intranationally. Pauli Murray at Society of Study of Black Religion in 78, your presentation in 1982 that you can still go and listen to on the internet at Clark Atlanta University's SSBR archives. How do we push toward that planetary? Not just institutionally, but also imaginatively, that we're always planetary. Fannie Lou Hamer's mind expanded going to the continent and then coming back to the U.S.
just a few thoughts. One is it requires real connections. The commitment is crucial, but the commitment also needs to be embodied and practiced. And to my mind, at least in recent experience, there's simply some of those, you named some very significant encounters in previous decades. Those are not as frequent outside the US. In the US, there's still many things happening, but the ways of bringing together people in some of the places in Latin America that happened in some very significant gatherings in the 70s and 80s just have a different face to them now for many reasons. And I think therefore that's something that, as I said, concerns me, and that I believe is an opportunity therefore to say, how is it that we can recapture some of that spirit, and it requires that kind of embodiment. I also think that the shared learning of how is it that formation happens, and it continues, of course, and because as long as people are suffering, then, if you will, liberation theology will still be emerging in those settings. But finding an articulate academic voice, that's a different matter, and that's secondary to the first in some sense, but it's also our work. I mean, that's where we move, and the things that we also are concerned about is what is the place of theology, liberation theology, in addressing the challenges that are planetary, and they're also very local. And then so therefore the last thing I'll mention is, I just think that the commitment and the connection also calls for ongoing practice of solidarity. And that this question of to whom are we accountable? I've loved so much what you said about that, Douglas, and Dean Walker. You're asking this question of who is it that we're accountable to in our scholarship, in our discipleship, and how is it that can we be accountable to someone whom we do not see? And so, hence the importance of connection and walking together, precisely also for the sake of accountability. And that, I believe, is also key for the future of liberation theology, if we can have this perspective that's also planetary, is that kind of mutual accountability.
Yeah. No, I don't have a lot to add. I agree with that. You know, we're always talking about the diaspora, right? But we have to also recognize that there is a diaspora of people struggling for freedom, and there's a diaspora of people who are suffering from injustice. And somehow we have to continue to lift that up. And we have to, you know, poverty and suffering and injustice makes strange bedfellows. And we who have the privilege of looking out and seeing the connections need to continue to lift up those connections. And that the suffering in one part of the world is connected to the suffering in another part of the world. And, you know, if our current regime keeps doing what it's doing, people are going to recognize the connections real quick, and the global realities that are the fascism that is global, building upon that which was already an untenable situation of suffering. And so, yeah, you know, and how do we find ways? I mean, one of the ways in which we can make global connections that people like Malcolm who did it didn't have, people like Du Bois who did it didn't have, Angela Davis didn't have, right? Fannie Lou Hamer didn't have. They didn't have the daggone internet.
Yeah.
So we need to make just use of the internet and of the cyber world. And we need to bring that in as we're forming new minds and all of that, bring that into the classroom so that they can travel to the places they would rather not travel, and to see the connections of the way in which what happens in one area is impacts another area, and even the commonalities. You know, I always think about, we're talking about this, the border, and trying to make the border safe and more stable and all of this kind of thing. Well, okay. Then it requires not only whatever they're trying to do here to keep people, but it requires us recognizing the way in which we've created an unstable and destabilize other countries that force people to come here. And so it requires work on both sides of the wall. And then maybe we can secure our borders because other people are living in lands and in countries that will sustain life. Then in as much as they aren't, then they're going to flee, you know, like Jesus and his family fled. And so they're going to flee. And so I think, again, we make just use of the internet to make those global connections, since we have it. And other people made those connections and they didn't have it.
Now, just use the technology, particularly in a moment where our large language models are really imperializing.
That's right.
Dominant modes of knowing and singular languages.
That's right.
Particularly English. Folks, I want to open this conversation up and include some more dancing minds in this. We've seen these two wonderful dancing minds here with Edgardo and Kelly. I want to open it up. If you have questions, we do have wonderful mics that we want you to use so we can pick the microphone, pick up your questions for our audience on the internet. Questions, we'll take about one or two, and then we'll do another round. Don't make me be Ferris Bueller. Anyone? Anyone? We have one. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Dr. Melanie Harris, here on faculty at Wake Forest School of Divinity and African American Studies. Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, it is a pleasure to greet you as a womanist. Powerful, powerful voice. Thank you so much. That tradition lives here too. I wondered if you might take this moment to also speak to Black women, particularly. Black women.
Yeah.
And just what would you say as a womanist, particularly because you do carry the great ancestral energy of Katie Cannon and James Cone and so many others who taught at Union. And a lot of Black women are looking for wisdom and guidance right now about finding refuge in Christian spaces, faith communities that are leaning into this temptation of heteropatriarchy.
So first of all, it is such a pleasure to be here with you, Dr. Melanie Harris, who is carrying forth and expanding the vocabulary of womanist theology, and particularly as you do your work in terms of liberation, and I use your work in my classes. And so this is a privilege and a pleasure. You should answer that question. I want to learn from you. I feel like I'm sitting before a Senate hearing and you trying to get me. But but no, thank you for your work and inviting this conversation, and let it be a conversation. You respond to it. Black women, boy, but for the women. And I really mean that. And leaning into, the Black church leaning into heteropatriarchy. When has it leaned out of it? Right.
Yeah.
You know? No. Jacqueline Grant and Katie Cannon and the work of Elizabeth Higginbottom, they let us, Cheryl Townsend Gilkes, they let us know long ago what the Maria Stewarts, what the Mary Church Terrells way back when already knew. That these black men up in here are trying to create a God in their own image and have institutionalized, well, what we now call misogynoir, right? And so what black women are doing is calling it out and holding the black church to be accountable to what it means to be black and what it means to be church. And we are standing on or living into, continuing the legacy of the Maria Stewart's, Mary Church Terrell, Sojourner Truths, et cetera. So first of all, this ain't new stuff from the black church, right? It may be stuff that they disguise in different ways, but it's not new stuff. Ebony Marshall Thurman is out there leading the way in calling out a particular black institution, but as it symbolizes all that. But let's say one thing about black women. Boy, how much longer are we going to have to try to save this democracy? Really. Every time it has moved inched a little further, it's been on our backs. And this previous election is an example of that. Here we had a woman of color, trying to act as Dolores Williams would say, a surrogate for our democracy. And the misogynoir of this country refused. Forget it wasn't about policies at all. Would rather vote for an amoral, moral narcissist, a psychopath, than vote for this woman of color. 92%. I know where, I don't have to walk around and say, oh, I didn't vote for him. I just got to be, they know I didn't vote for him. 92%. 92% of us, if not more, tried again to carry this country closer toward freedom, and it was rejected. And as a result, black women are now disproportionately dispossessed of livelihood. That's no accident. Yet, black women continue to try to move us toward freedom. Because to move our community toward that is to move a nation toward that and a people toward that. So, what I have to say about black women is, in spite of it all, I think we continue to be sort of, talk about North Star, we talk about stars. And see, I think we looking in the wrong direction. Let's not look up. Let's look down. Where those are the stars. And so, so Melanie, help me here because I get the sort of the point. But that's to me the embodied testimonies of black women, and and I think Katie Cannon, you're right, always says it well. We tend to have amnesia about those women, but we must indeed learn from the embodied texts that are black women. And when we do that, then we get just a little bit closer to understanding really who this God that moves us toward freedom is all about. And so black women continue to carry the scars, even as black women continue to carry and bear the hope.
Got 1, 2, and then we'll get back. So Derek, just pass it next. After you finish, pass it right down here.
This has just been wonderful, just a wonderful panel. My name is Derek Hicks. I'm Associate Professor of Religion and Culture here at Wake Forest School of Divinity, also teaching at the intersection of African American religious life and foodway culture at this moment. Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, you were the topic of conversation in my theology class last
that's
night.
too bad.
I'm sorry. Yeah. You're on the spot, triple time today. But we were, in fact, discussing, and I had wonderful student presentations of Katie Geneva Cannon's work, and I told them of a story where the one conversation I had one-on-one with Katie Cannon right after I got my PhD, I'd given a lecture at UPenn. I was hit hard by a historian who didn't like the way I used Baby Suggs Holy as a marker for the Logos, right? And I told this to Dr. Cannon, and she said, she kind of pat me on the head and said, look, you just keep on using fiction and literature because womanists have had to expand the canon from the jump. And she said, stories get people into the Holy of Holies in ways that actual history never can.
That's right.
When we talked about that last night, I then brought the story that you told in What's Faith Got to Do with It up to the students, and how it is that you responded through that book to the reason that you can stay Christian in amongst this insanity. Could you speak to young folks? I have 3 children, 2, one full adult, one who thinks she's an adult, and one budding young man who will someday be an adult. And no matter how much I pump this truth of narrative and story and history into them, I'm not saying they articulate a nihilism, but there is a sense in which they don't actually see this world the way that you and I would see this world. What do you say to these young folks who need the premise and prism of womanist theological discourse and understanding and liberative discourses through theology? What do you say to them to get them on a path to be fruitful in their quest for full humanity going forward?
Oh.
Should be right here.
Well, and again, I'll be anxious to even hear other responses. My son is now in his young 30s, but as many know, really, my last 2 books were written really through trying to answer your question and through conversations with him that sort of sprang from his late teens for Stand Your Ground through his 20s in Resurrection Hope. And so my son is, I always think, sort of in that sort of liminal space of not quite an Afro-pessimist, though leaning there, and certainly not, hopeful kind of Martin Luther King, Dream Obama, or Jesse Hope Alive kind of person. So that's why I think fugitivity is good, because it's the middle way between that sort of utopian ideal of freedom and being an Afro-pessimist, right? But so what do I say? That was my last book. What am I going to say to you? Because when you already said, this little God of the black God and all that ain't doing me no good. This black Christ, as he said to me, yeah, okay, God's black, Jesus is black, but what good is it doing us now? Fine. You know what? It's not so much, and I mean this, what I say, but what I try to witness to, and the stories that I try to tell him, and the stories that I try to call other black youth to. That's the importance of this history and these stories. I tell my son the stories of just our family. I mean, my great-grandmother was born into slavery, right? While my father was college educated, no one before him was in his family. I tell the stories of my son, now even as quite an adult, continues to ask, don't you get tired? Because you lived through the 60s, and here we are, right? And he continues to say, black people need to figure out how to do it a different way, because this clearly isn't working. What we're doing, and so he's almost even sort of national. We need to go somewhere else and live. I mean, so what I try to do is to make sure that he's not left in despair, but I also listen to him and listen to them. And what I really mostly try to do, and this is the truth, I tell them the story so that they stay in the struggle. And what I really mostly try to do, I know that's bad, my editor's sitting out there, if I put that in a book, really mostly, Robert would. To correct the sentence. But and no book could I have written without, you'll hear from him later, without Robert Ellsberg, period. Believed in me when I didn't believe in me. But what I try to do is empower them so that they can get us to a different future. Because clearly what we haven't done hadn't done it. And so I listen. I do, this is the truth, I do most of the listening in regard to my son. And he teaches me, and I do most of the listening to young people, even in my classroom space. And what they write. Oh, Melanie, you should see some of the things and the questions that the students write. The black women, in particular, in my class I'm teaching now on women's theology up at Harvard. And it's like, yeah. And so my task is just to keep them living into hope, that they can make a difference. And that means that I tell them the stories of how far we've come. And let them keep, and I know that they're going to chart a different course. I hope they do. And so to get us out of this Groundhog Day of history, of this historical pattern. But yeah, so that, I try to witness to the fact that I'm not giving up, and try to tell the stories of people who didn't give up. And then I do a whole lot of affirming and listening to them.
My name is Hart. I'm a partially retired pastor. Good to be here. My question is difficult, one I struggle with, many others do, is what does liberation mean for men? I'm a pale-faced guy, obviously. But in the last election, some 15% of young men from ages 18 to early 30s, 15% shifted toward the crazy white guy. I find this deeply disturbing. I do.
We should.
Mea culpa.
We all should.
What I don't see are many efforts toward the liberation of men in our society. We're going through a period where we're feeling really pitiful about ourselves, which I find very unsatisfactory. So I wonder what response we might think about in terms of the liberation of men. My own involvement now is with Father Richard Rohr's Illumine men's movement, and with a growing movement called Men for Choice, developing allies and advocates for reproductive freedom, particularly focusing on young men. But I'll leave the question there. Where do we go with liberation for men from this horrible, I don't like to use the phrase toxic masculinity, it doesn't lead very many good places. There are men that are messed up. What are better options? Thank you.
Men?
Edgardo.
Liberation theology has always understood that for there to be liberation, there needs to be liberation for all, and that those who are complicit in oppressive structures are also in need of liberation themselves. And so, in a sense, the challenge is not a new one. It's simply, if you will, metastasizes in different ways that require then the treatment. And I don't have an answer, a quick answer for this beyond in the concrete. As a pastor, retired pastor, you have to listen to the person who's and engage the person who's in front of you. So there, I would say again, encounter, and so that's and as we're hearing how to engage the young, there's also the listening and trying to then and to model something different, and also to as I follow these things, I'm not an expert on the demographics and the social changes. There's some disillusionment as well that has happened with people thinking that they were going to get something that ended up not getting. So we'll see how some of the aspects of that pan out. But I would say that at the core of it is, again, the recognition that liberation is liberation for all, and that all of us are trapped in different ways within the current structures. And that part of it, what I would see is also the helping people to, young white men, to expand their imagination as to who is the we, and what is their community, and to be drawn out of these exclusive kind of hard-edge communities that seeks to exclude to something that's bigger that allows them to actually become more. And so I don't have much wisdom to offer there beyond that saying that that the message of liberation is very much for them too.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. Let's say two quick things. One, there's a model for that, and that model is Jesus on the cross, emptying himself of all of the privilege that would prevent him from entering into complete, uncompromised solidarity. As Gustavo Gutierrez describes the crucifixion of Jesus as his uncompromised solidarity with the oppressed. And in order to do that, he had to empty himself of the privileges of his maleness, of his Jewishness, of his citizenship, etc., to do that. So the times he didn't do it, he entered into the manosphere in relationship to the Syrophoenician woman. He was called back to recognizing and emptying himself of this. It's sort of like it's called sort of a liberatory kenosis, that you empty yourself of this privilege. You have to name it. The other thing that, and to my last point, you're right, we also have to recognize the socioeconomic conditions that create this kind of desperation, this illusion, this feeling left behind, because a lot of people are left behind and aren't people of color, and so we have to begin to attack the systems and structures that create this kind of inequality. The greatest threat to democracy is inequality. And so some of those young men that you speak of speak out of those spaces. The other thing to recognize as well, and more probably that which is more pervasive, is, dominating oppressive power. We call it gaslighting now. They find ways to gaslight. And that's what's going on here. And it is heteropatriarchy gaslighting. And saying, oh, no, you aren't oppressed, we are. You know, that's gaslighting. And, you know, power does that. That's the discourse of power. You know, Foucault talks about that discourse of power. But it is the discourse of power. They find ways to stay in power and to keep others subjugated. And this is what we see going on right now. And people buy into that. People believe that. And particularly people who have been left behind or feel disenfranchised. And they look for ways, power gaslights, power scapegoats, all of those things. The task of those men who know, those white men who know, who have the luxury of understanding and knowing, is to help those others to see and to live in an otherwise possibility, and to name and recognize their privileges and recognize what it is that is keeping them in the place that they don't want to be. Yeah. You know, I always think about when they, with SNAP and all of that, that as this administration, you know, was actually seeking permission from the Supreme Court not to feed people, that, I mean, it's true, they were, it's not lying, that everyone, you know, they were acting like the only people that were on SNAP were people of color. And when in actual fact, people of color may have disproportionately been on SNAP, but demographically, the most people that were on SNAP were white people. And if someone could have broken through that and said to them, no, well, y'all, you ain't just holding back the people of color, this is impacting you. And I kind of, and well, some people on SNAP said, let's keep it shut down so people will recognize. And, you know, what breaks in to that delusion that's created by, that illusion rather, that's created by sort of this gaslighting that's going on by this current regime that we have in power. So we have to lift it up and be the voice that does that.
Authoritarianism does recruit, and it recruits generationally.
And it has a will to knowledge, and it creates the knowledge it needs to stay in power.
Yep. Yeah, we have 2 questions in the back. Our Dean of Admissions right there.
Good morning. This question is on behalf of Dr. Melva Sampson, who's unable to be here with us today as she is traveling to SSBR. But this is her question as she's watching virtually Dr. Brown Douglas. She states that I identify as a womanist. I take on digital Black religion. I'm currently reading Black Transhuman Liberation Theology by Philip Butler, as we will give a talk later on this evening at SSBR. And I'm wondering, as we talk about the future of liberation theology, if you and our other distinguished panelists will consider going a little bit deeper to talk about at least what Butler suggests is the way that liberation theology must begin to engage current and emergent technologies, to talk a little bit about us being transhuman, or at least as the way that Butler talks about how humans have always been transhuman. Interested to hear your thoughts. And again, thank you for being here with us.
I'm gonna let you talk. I've not read yet Butler's work, and so I can't speak specifically to that. But first of all, to say and give my, again, gratitude to people like Dr. Melva Sampson, and to the SSBR, the Society of Study of Black Religion, again, which is the cauldron out of which we all have found our voice and have given us the space, given me the space to do the work that I do. And so, hi to the people at SSBR, and thank you for being the container to help grow Black womanist and theologies. And so, I can't speak specifically at all to that work, and thank you, Dr. Sampson, for bringing that work back to my attention to read. And so I would be anxious to hear that dialogue. And so I don't know beyond stating again the importance of using that kind of technology in a just way, at the same time not allowing that technology to obscure the embodied humanity of peoples. And so what's that balance? And again, I don't know the arguments in Dr. Butler's book, and so we'll be called to it.
Only thing I do not know those arguments either. I will simply speak to a recent document that I alluded to from the International Theological Commission called Quo Vadis Humanitas, Where Are You Going Humanity? And that engages on these questions. Part of it has to do with the terms. How do we define the terms transhuman, post-human? We may not be talking about the same things. And so I want to be careful. I think we'd have to first reflect on that. But in that document, it begins with engaging those kinds of questions and then concludes with the significance of the poor. And I think that's, for future liberation theology, we need to engage the digital revolution. We need to engage AI. And we need to do so also with the marginalized, the oppressed, those left behind, being very much in the conversation. Because there's a ways in which the digital technology, as we know, is one that is being controlled by a few billionaires who are becoming wealthier, trillionaires, and that it's at the cost of increasing the carbon footprint with tremendous impact on power grids and continuing the climate contribution to adverse climate change in the planet, and also these questions of what does it mean to be human, and how do we value human work, and that work and humanity with its frailties and limitations being good as well. So many questions that I do see as very important for us to reflect on, and that I think are going to be key for the future of liberation theology.
I agree.
We got time for one more. We got one right there.
Yeah, the short person gets overlooked a lot of times. God's best blessings to everybody. The Lord be praised. Mama Joyce Delane Brown. I'm the unofficial, official mother of the whole campus, and in particular the Divinity School. I have a question in particular about I would like you to address the diminishing role of the church in all of this, because since people aren't going to church as much. And I was wondering if that's how that's affecting the Latinx, brown community, how that's affecting them. So that's one question. And then the other is more of a comment, more so, as far as bringing youth back into a space like the church and the social constructs of the church. Being the mother of two sons that are science fiction head, they go to these things all the time. So I was wondering how we could tie things like that, of course, again, addressing the internet, YouTube, all of that, how we could get over this generation, and I'm a child of the 60s as well, because I'm 70 years old. How could we get over the way they embrace things, the way they see it? They see it, this is how I socialize. I'm either going to socialize over the internet some kind of way, or I'm going to socialize by going to science fiction cons, Renaissance fairs, all those kinds of things. How do we reach people to bring them into the space where they know, hey, we need to fight the regime? Is that one of the avenues we could use to do something like that?
See, I think that they're finding their ways to fight the regime, and quote unquote. And we have to recognize that. I mean, we're growing up, I'm sure that, our parents and our grandparents are like, what are these kids doing? They out in the streets, they protest, all the stuff that was going on. I'm not so concerned about getting them into the church. If the church was relevant, then it would be relevant. And so the church has to continue to move toward being church. I often say, and I don't mean this as a cliche, but that there's a difference between being a social institution that happens to be religious and being a church. And that if the church would live into being church, then perhaps we wouldn't have to have this kind of conversation. So I'm not concerned about trying to get kids back into the church. Maybe that's not where they're supposed to be. And the fact that they aren't there calls the church to account. Something's wrong with the church. And so the church needs to say, why aren't they here? Why aren't they coming here? How do we lose them? Well, something's wrong with the church. And so we need to begin to, I just keep saying, if they're at Renaissance fairs or whatever and doing their thing, then let's see what they're doing there. Then what are the ways that they are challenging the way life is right now, and the ways in which they are concerned about their future, because they are concerned about their future. And so, you want your kids, we're going to make sure kids are healthy and they aren't doing things that are going to close off, making mistakes that close off life possibilities and close off their flourishing. But, we need to look at where they are resisting and making a statement and trying to live in a way that is contrary to the way which created this mess. And so I guess, I'm more concerned about us than I am about them. And I'm more concerned about the church than I am about them not being there. The last thing I'll say, just to look at who knew that we could have an Episcopal witness of what it means to get people back in the church. But I could joke about being Episcopalian because I'm Episcopalian. Our former presiding bishop lives down here in North Carolina. Used to Michael Curry. Right, and of course. And he and I came up together through the Episcopal Church, and he called the Episcopal Church back into the Jesus movement. So when he came into the church, we need to be a part of the Jesus movement. And some of my non-Episcopal siblings, like yourself, said, "Well, what were y'all doing all along?" But that would be the question for all of us. But, Episcopalians sort of had that reputation. Doris, he said that if he has one, if he could define his legacy by one thing, it would be to get each Episcopalian to know one scripture by heart that's not Jesus wept. But, so for me to give an example of the way in which we get people back in the church from the Episcopal perspective is kind of ironic. But there's some truth to it. When my bishop and friend Mary Ann Buddy gave that sermon at the thing at the cathedral, the inauguration service, more people in a new demographic of Episcopalians start flooding Episcopal churches. Mm-hmm. And I work, as you heard, as well at the Washington National Cathedral. We have seen, and it continues, a growth in a new demographic because what Bishop Buddy did was speak the truth of, a religion that really is born of liberation, a liberation theological viewpoint. She just talked about justice, mercy, kindness. You know, as my son said, why was everyone so upset? She was just talking about the gospel. That drew people back into Episcopal churches because she spoke the truth of the gospel and dared to do it in the face of power. That's the church being church. And so if we're concerned about young people being in the church, then we need to start being church.
I want to see young people in church. I have young people who are my children. And at the same time, not all church growth is good, nor is all church decline bad. The church has problems, and that face of the church turns people away, rightly. At the same time, I would want to say, the church ultimately is not the problem. The church is the face of Christ, and it is ultimately the instrument for liberation in the world. And as examples of that liberating face of the gospel are present, then people will see there's something else in the church. It doesn't mean that it'll grow then either, but it may face new challenges, but then there will be the challenges that the gospel has always faced, the challenges that Jesus himself faced when he preached the sermon in Nazareth. And so growth, decline, they are signs. And I do think that, and I see signs of good growth and glimmers of a waxing light in the church amidst many contradictions. And so my hope would be for young people to be drawn to the church, but to be drawn for the right reasons, and to find in the church life.
Correct.
Last question.
Hey, I'm Abby. I'm a first-year Master of Divinity student. I wrote my question down, so forgive me for looking at my phone. But how does liberation theology answer religion becoming both historically and currently a partner of imperialism and colonialism, especially in light of real-time examples that we're seeing and living through today? I think it's something that my generation is very frustrated with and very angry about, that we're seeing religion be used to justify genocide, be used to justify war and hatred. And I'm just curious, as we're moving forward in liberation theology, how do we move it from the walls of academia, from this conversation, and to a new generation?
The frustration is understandable, and it's not new.
Right.
Since Christianity came to the Americas, it came with those two faces. It came with an oppressive face, Christopher Columbus, Christoferos, the Christ bearer, Colonus, who colonizes. You can't make these things up. The Christ bearers who colonizes, that was his name. That was the face of the church. Just a few years later, fourth Sunday of Advent, Anton de Montesinos preached a sermon in 1511, denouncing the oppression of the indigenous people and basically saying, repent or perish in sin, to the Spanish who were there. So this has been our history, and we have to acknowledge that. And with that, the possibility, therefore, of saying not that, but this. And again, when those examples, Bishop Buddy, a recent one too there in that regard, and so many others, to say that is present too. And it more so than what gets picked up on the news, which will be all the other stuff. So I think, yes, frustrating. The two faces are also within me as well, and I struggle with those two. And then I'm so lifted up when I'm called out on when I'm portraying the wrong face, and when I see other people who are the face of Christ in a life-giving way in the world.
No, I absolutely agree with that. There've always been those two narratives, at least since Constantine instigated the tradition of Christianity being in collusion with the empire with his conversion. And so white Christian nationalism isn't new. It's a part of a long legacy of Christianity functioning in that way. But there's always also been another narrative. And so it is the responsibility of those who proclaim the liberation narrative of Christianity to be as present on the public square as those who would do otherwise. And so we can't leave the vacuum, which I think in many respects we left, that allowed for white Christian nationalism to emerge as vocally and as strongly as it has. So it calls us out back to the public square.
Pope Leo will visit Africa in April.
I thought you were getting ready to say he was going to be here too.
Oh. We should get, and he'll start in Algeria, visiting the African church. And often when we narrate Christianity, we narrate it outside of the African church.
That's right.
And the African church speaking to the Italian church. And oftentimes that then hops over centuries and we say Christianity is a European religion.
Right.
As John Mbiti reminds us in 1969, Christianity is as indigenous and a traditional and an African religion as any indigenous, traditional, and African religion.
Well, as I always say, the enslavers and captors who invaded Africa to steal its resources, human and otherwise, and it's such a big introduced Africans to Christianity, but they didn't introduce them to God.
That's right.
And what we truly know is Christianity was born from that continent.
That's right.